Welcome, everyone. Today, I'm joined by Ginine Capozzi, the founder and owner of KnowledgeForce Consulting. Janine started the firm over 10 years ago with a core belief that really stands out, that your workforce is your knowledge force, not just a headcount, but a strategic asset. She's worked with over 75 organizations, including Fortune 500 companies, and make them move away from traditional content-focused training towards what she calls training reimagined. That creates strategically designed learning experiences that drive measurable organizational change. Beyond knowledge work, he's also built a coaching practice around what he describes as the power of one. The idea that one conversation, one idea, one action can change everything. Janine, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks. I'm so happy to join you today.
Well, I guess, Janine, let's go back to that statement that your workforce is your knowledge force. I'm sure we've all been in those companies where training feels like a check the box event that everyone just wants to go through. And I'm curious when you first talking to a client, like how do you help them see that viewing it that way as just an event is actually holding them back? Is there like a specific moment where that light bulb goes off?
That's such an excellent question. So, usually people who are drawn to me already have a bit of an understanding that the training that they're doing just doesn't work, right? They're not getting the results that they're hoping for, or, they keep hearing commentary or feedback that, the training was boring or things weren't clicking or nothing is changing. So, most of the time when people are drawn to me, it's because they already recognize that there's a bit of a problem. And one of the things that I work on helping them understand and helping them do to sell to the other decision makers within the organization, or if I have some skeptics, is really thinking about the power of incremental change, right? We will work with organizations that will do anything to gain 1%, 2% efficiency. Manufacturing clients that look at it and say, if we could just have 1% better return, or financial organizations that talk about, just one more percent, if we could just move from 7% return to an 8% return. Look, imagine what we could do for our clients. And every time I hear that, I laugh, because I think about that investment, that chase that we go after. But 1% of human behavior is 5 minutes a day. And so if we think about, the change of a 1% of 5 minutes on a typical work day and compound those week after week, and then we think about the exponential return of if I interact with you differently, interact with me differently. Now we're expounding that 1% change. And so when we start to boil down behaviors like that into minutes and increments of time, all of a sudden it becomes really like an aha moment, like you were asking, like, what's the aha of how is this possible? And then the beauty about human dynamics is that we are constantly rebuilding ourselves. Literally, biologically, our cells are constantly reshaping themselves. So if we embrace training and development as something that is more of like an organic thing that is continuing to happen, we're in a constant place of possible growth and possible change. And so I try to help people understand it first. That's step one of reimagining the experience, right? If I can see people in this idea that they can grow, they can change, and we can do it in tiny 1% moments at a time, right? And stack those together, that becomes really powerful. When you start to see that, you can start to translate into, okay, then what do we need to do in those learning moments that aren't just formal, but also the informal ones that help unlock that potential in others? And once that message starts to land with people, they get excited about it because it doesn't feel boring, and it doesn't feel like an uphill climb, and it doesn't feel like just another expense on the company. It feels like an opportunity. And I think that's where the starting point is for me.
I like that. It's a small change for the powerful one. And I guess it's
Yeah.
like they say, when you do it like as 5 minutes, it's kind of like what gets measured gets improved. So, mhm.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Mhm.
And, one of the things that people sometimes fear is the things that we're measuring. Right. Well, what if behavior gets worse? I was like, okay, let it get worse before it gets better. Right. We have to understand that change is very slow before it becomes very fast. And there's a lot of neuroscience around the fact that, brain based things that are happening. And when you start to understand those, you can understand why some of the, you know, training takes time before it unlocks. But then once it does, the returns on that investment are really powerful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I guess how do you deal with some teams may have dynamic roles in them, you know? So I guess how do you deal with that when there's training for them and they kind of have to have different things to improve, I'd say. Do you
You
ever
mean
get that?
different? Yeah, so when you're saying dynamic, are you asking like they wear lots of hats within an organization, so they're getting trained on all different types of things? Or you mean there's team dynamics like personality conflict?
Ooh, good points. I mean, like different hats.
Yeah, different hats. So, yeah, that happens all the time, right? Especially in small startup organizations. People are wearing multiple hats. They're doing multiple things with their day. So, some things that I work with people on is trying to document as they go. There's a ton of tools out there today, and I don't want to, endorse any specific tool, but there are ways that you can capture what you're doing as you go. One of
Hmm.
my biggest beliefs is that when you have to learn it and you can teach it and talk about it to others, you're really anchoring in what your role is. So, especially in startup organizations, I always encourage people that the people who are in those jobs, their job is to document what they're doing. And it's okay if there's mistakes or there are process improvements. The conversation of like showing it to somebody and asking questions about it is the iterative refinement that helps those things get built so that you can scale when those roles come. So that's like a really tactical way to think about it. But from
Hmm.
a managerial perspective, if you were developing something for yourself, and then we just get to have like a conversation about it, you ask me questions and I ask you questions, it becomes pretty clear pretty fast where the gaps in the learning are. And it's not to like cause trouble for anybody or, like be negative about it or critique them or criticize them. It's to say we can't improve what we're not talking about. So if I don't know, you don't know what you don't know when you're first in a job. So that conversation of talking about it often helps surface those things that are expectations or sticking points that they could solve together. But a lot of people kind of suffer in isolation in new jobs when they're wearing all
Oh,
those
yeah,
hats because they're just trying to figure it out on their own. And, you know, that doesn't always work. So,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, that environment has to be fostered to know where you can just talk to somebody because it really does help.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And sometimes you solve your own problems when you step away from the hyper focus of the thing that you're working on, right? So I
Hmm.
don't know what I'm doing. I go talk to somebody about it. They say something. I still might be a little stuck. And then the aha light goes off. I mean, we literally talk about it as light bulb moments or ahas, where your brain clicks and it connects with the thing that will get you unstuck. And very rarely staying in an isolated moment of you working on things alone triggers that unstuck moment. It's not really the way the brain recognizes ways out of a problem. So I always say the more comfortable you can be with talking with others about it, the quicker you're going to reach those resolutions or at least steps to get you a little unstuck and go forward.
Absolutely. And I think you have mentioned before, you talk about putting the S and L&D, learning and development, right? You have
Yeah.
strategy, scalability, and sustainability. You know, if I guess if we look at the actual human output of that, you know, when you're building those systems, how do you like measure it? Like what an organization you measure you're working with to ensure that the workforce is actually evolving to meet the business needs.
Yeah. So good question. So yeah, I love the putting the S in L and D. It came from a marketing person, which I think is super cute. But when I was
Hmm.
talking about it with her, she said, "Well, what makes you different?" And I said, "It's about this idea that most people stay stuck in measuring the event, right? The thing that we're using to scale. But training sticks or it doesn't stick based upon the strategy and the scalability or the sustainment, not just the scalability. So it's just not how do I get content to you or how do I get you involved in a new training program? It's what is the strategic benefit of doing that thing? And then how do we sustain that over time? So that's a conversation I like to have with clients too, because they often get frustrated that they're sending people to training or they're doing something with it, or they invest in an expensive conference. They send one person to an expensive conference to listen to information, take it back, and then nothing, right? It's like, well, we didn't have a strategy for what they were going to learn, and they didn't have a strategy for how they were going to apply it and pass that knowledge on to others in an organization. And so, therefore, human behavior just kind of evaporates, it just disappears.
Mhm.
So I work with clients to think about that, those three areas: the strategy, the scalability, sustainability. And we measure using a tool that is something that I've worked on over the years called return on talent investment. So the ROTI. And what we look at is each one of those areas of measurement, kind of like a dashboard through four lenses. The first lens is traditional metrics. What are there any traditional metrics with an organization that they can use as a measurement of progress? Do we want those numbers to go up? Do we want those numbers to go down? What do we want to do with those numbers, right? So traditional
Mhm.
metrics. The second one that I have them look at is what are enhancements or changes to policies, procedures, processes that we can follow? What efficiencies can we get out of that? And can we measure those? So at the end of the training, for example, we've got 3 new processes that we've looked at, or we've streamlined 5 new ways to go about, capturing sales leads. If we're doing that, training's effective too because it's directly impacting business. We look for benchmarks then through the lens of people. So, employee engagement surveys, or sick time, or retention, or even just things like asking questions in collaboration. Are you getting asked more questions? Sometimes being asked more questions is a measurement of success because it means people are thinking about it, or they're processing their information, or they're more interested in doing it right than doing it wrong and reworking it later. So, thinking about, okay, are there measurements? One of the ones that scares people that I always say is, do we get more complaints to HR? They're like, we don't want more complaints at HR. And I always say, no, no, sometimes we do. Because if you had a manager who goes through, like, essential or difficult conversations training, for example, and they get comfortable with the idea that they need to have these, and they're not going to be perfect at them at the beginning, and their employees who are being held accountable are not going to be happy that they're having them, right? So
Mhm.
complaints or frustration sometimes goes up, which actually is a measure that the
Mhm.
training is working. And then we can work on bringing them back down the other side after people get used to them. And then the last piece that I have people always look through is strategy, and looking
Mhm.
at it and say, how is the training helping us advance towards a, 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 year strategy? What are we doing? Thinking about that. So when you look at training as a more holistic situation, rather than just it costs us money to invest in people, and it can be difficult to measure whether or not their behavior has really changed something. You got to like zoom out and look for other indicators of what success can look like. So I walk people through a process that does that, that gets them thinking. And a lot of companies don't even have any benchmarks to begin with. So we have to get
Mhm.
creative thinking about that data and that benchmark, and what are we going to be comfortable with, and then go from there.
That's awesome. It's really customized, and I guess when you first started out, how did you come out with that approach?
Yeah. So it was realistic that I was getting frustrated with people saying, like, you know, it was just smile sheets, but nothing would change, right? So that's like the standard. People do it in a survey at the end of training. Did you like that training? People would walk out giving, presenters or whatever, facilitators, high marks. But then we would hear 6 months later that none of those behaviors had really changed. So that frustration point was like, okay, we've got to think about what's broken in that system, and how do we break the event based thinking? I send you
Mhm.
to an event, you learn something, you come back a different human. It's like, if that was the way that everything worked, we wouldn't have like diabetes and smokers, and I would exercise the appropriate amount of time every week, right? If
Right.
knowledge was behavior change, then the world would look very different. Knowledge does not equal behavior change. Knowledge is a starting point of behavior change. So the reason I laugh about that is because I kept bumping into the same problem. It was like, okay, well, how can we begin to measure something that doesn't look at it through just one lens? Because people are complicated and there's multiple dynamic inputs that are in about people. And as a result of that, we've got to think about how do we measure that more comprehensively? And how do we start to look at momentum and progress towards the goal versus the overall goal? And that's also where the 1% really started to matter and pay attention. I would watch manufacturing organizations as a perfect example, but it happens in lots of organizations, tech companies that are selling software. They chase this elusive 1%, 1% revenue, 1% cuts in expenses. All this 1%, 1%, 2%, 5%, when they have exponential percent available to them with their people. And they kept overlooking it and overlooking it and overlooking it. And it's like, well, why are we overlooking people when they are the 1% we've been chasing? It's 5 minutes a day. And I thought it's because they don't know how to measure that 1%. That's where it started.
I see. Wow, that's I like that you notice that gap and then you close it in. I
Mm-hmm.
guess when you position yourself as a chief learning officer for some clients, right?
Yeah.
So I guess what kind of organizations are best for that? Be
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, great question. Thanks for spotlighting the services that I do as well.
of
I
course.
appreciate that. I appreciate that. So the chief learning officer, a fractional chief officer role. So mid to small size organizations often don't have their own L&D departments or their own talent development kind of capacity to be able to do that in house. And so they start to look outside for organizations that can offer them, like what we refer to as off the shelf training. Let's send them to this leadership program. Let's send them to a conference. Let's, take an online course. There's nothing wrong with those resources, right? But most people come back and have a really hard time translating that standard off the shelf stuff to what the heck do I do with it at my company? And that gap is also another friction point for it kind of falling by the wayside and not being used. So, what I often tell some of those mid or small sized organizations is let's work together. And over the course of anywhere from 12 to 24 months, I come in, I work with those organizations, usually on a percentage of my time basis, typically is what happens. And we develop out training programs, we develop out systems for continued feedback and reinforcement, and we look at training through a little bit of a different lens. And so I let them do or work with them to do is think about where do they want their organization to be in 5 years and what's the roadmap or the blueprint to get there. Once they usually have that blueprint, we can then identify, are there internal people who, as a portion of their job, could take on the responsibility to develop that training or that content, or a portion of their job to do mentorship or coaching. And we look for ways to solve the gap that doesn't require them to keep a learning and development professional on staff full time. So I come in for a short period, I help them design something, help them think about standing it up for themselves, and then I back out. And then every once in a while I go back in to kind of recalibrate, or somebody leaves and they need a little bit of a step back in. But it ends up helping human resource professionals. Learning and development often gets folded under human resources, but it's its whole discipline within itself. So there are some HR people who are fantastic at developing talent, and there are others who don't have that expertise or that interest. And so you bring in somebody who can.
I see. So kind of that
Yeah.
level overview down to identifying the people who can make it happen.
Absolutely. It's all the way from strategy down to scalability and sustainment,
Yep.
right? So the people who can make it happen. Yeah.
All right. Well, on your side, you talk about the power of one
Mhm.
conversation, one idea, those kinds of things. So coming from, I guess, when you start working from a client, how do you help them isolate that one thing, or is it like separate from KnowledgeForce Consulting versus what you do like personally?
Oh, yeah. Thanks. So, Power of One, let me give you a tiny little background. And I've weaved a little bit of Power of One conversation in what we've already had today. But
Mhm.
when I was a little girl, my mom used to always say to me, Janine, never underestimate the power of one. It's the only number that changes anything. And that, like, as a kid, it didn't really mean much. But over time, I started to understand that she meant people. And it informed my philosophy of training, development, leadership. And because things tend to be so event based, we don't know how to scale it. We don't know how to make it powerful. You just go do this one thing and then it's done. And I'm a visual thinker. So I always think about it as like my one arrow that I get to shoot at the target and it goes way off course because I didn't plan for how I wanted to hit my target. And so Power of One is really a framework. And I share it with my leaders that I work with to think about scanning your environment regularly for one small thing, one conversation that needs to be had, one insight that comes out of that conversation, one action that can be taken. So I was saying, thinking about that, I work with leaders to talk about how can they embed that philosophy every day. So when I'm walking down the hall and somebody comes and asks me a question, I can say to them, well, what do you think about that? Or, what insight do you have about that idea? Or I might share something with them and say, this is how I would handle it. And, what are you taking away from what I just shared? So I can ask one question to them that generates another extra connection in the brain. And then you ask for the action or the commitment. What do you want to do with that? What should we do with that? What's our smallest, embarrassingly small step that we need to take to move it forward? When you turn Power of One into a habit, it just becomes your conversation flow. Like
Mhm.
you're always asking, well, what do we think about that? What are we taking away? How did we learn? What is the next thing? What do we want to do? And when you stack enough of those moments together towards a targeted goal, you're actually creating that powerful momentum. So I teach people the framework. I work with people to practice crafting some of their own Power of One conversation questions. I turn people into hunting for new insights and actions and help them realize that they're happening all around us. And then the accountability piece is making sure that we're taking on action. And sometimes an action is a non-action. Like I'm going to step away and let my team make that decision. Or I'm not loving the way that this meeting is being handled by so and so right now. But they're going to learn more if I don't interject and fix it than if I do jump in and fix it. So my action is non-action. I'm going to choose to do nothing. And maybe later I'll go have a Power of One conversation with them. What did you take from that meeting? What do you want to keep doing? If you had a do-over, what would you do? So it's a leadership coaching framework, but it ripples into a lot of different areas of business leadership.
That's awesome. I like that. It really shows like, the strategy and like taking that into, I guess, the daily workday and putting it
Yes.
into action. And I can say that would have made like a game changer for me if I had known it when I was in the corporate world. So yeah.
Yeah, right.
Mhm.
And it's a way, in corporate world, everybody talks about feedback culture, right? We
Mhm.
want to develop a feedback culture. But they all think that feedback culture means I've got to pull you in the office for a 15-minute meeting and do what I jokingly call the bologna sandwich, which is I give you a positive, I tell you I want you to fix something, and then I sandwich with it how great you are. And then I walk away wondering why you didn't change, right?
Mhm.
And it's like, because you gave me a bologna sandwich. Like,
Yeah.
oh, do I get to choose what part of the sandwich I want? Like,
Mhm.
like the good stuff or whatever. So we take it as like I've got to bring you in for these formal moments, and they're so terrible for people. But if I see them as powerful 90-second increments of conversation, that's human dynamics. It's how we're learning. And so, like,
Mhm.
we're actually engaging in the framework right now. And your listeners will engage in the framework as we're talking about it. They're going to listen to this conversation. They're going to be thinking about something. They'll have their own, oh my gosh moment, something that clicks for them. I have no idea what that will be, but something will click for somebody in the conversation. And then the last piece of the puzzle is them deciding what do they want to do or not do with that. They can
Mhm.
have it be kind of like of an arrow that misses. So we had a conversation, I had an idea, and then it flopped because I did nothing, or I can decide the action I want to take and I can launch that towards my target. And when I stack more of those over and over with time, I start to actually hit things I want to be hitting. So, yeah, make a big difference in corporate America if they actually talk to people like that, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And then, yeah, and it's better than a scheduled meeting, right? When we're already so busy. Yeah.
Yeah, better than scheduled meeting, better than pulling you separately, better than your leader saying, "Hey, can I talk to you later?" And
Mhm.
then you spend the rest of the day with your head being like, "Oh my gosh, what am I in trouble? What was this about?" And all they want
Mhm.
to do is ask you like a silly question and ask your input on something. Like I worried about that all day. It's just
Right.
it's just terrible. It's just terrible.
Exactly. Like I need to focus.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
You mentioned something on our pre-call about how you had a new book coming out, or you contributed to a new book that was coming out, right? So
Yeah.
I think it launched January, right? It's called Game Changers.
Yes, exactly. It's called Game Changers. Yep. Um, I'm so excited about this because it's an anthology, and I contributed a chapter to this anthology with incredible other people. Actually, I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you the cover because I'm so excited about it. So,
Ooh.
um, I know, fancy, right? A little game
Yeah.
changer sitting on my desk.
Mhm.
So it was put together by or organized by Monica Coronetti and Jonathan Peters, who are the leaders of an organization called Sententia. And it's gamification, right? How do we add motivation mechanics into learning and development into the workplace? And I'm excited because I get to be with my peers in this book, and the Power of One and the framework is actually featured in the book, and it's available on Amazon. And
Wow.
we made a bestseller status in several categories. So we're really excited that it's available to share with people who are looking to do L&D the right way.
Absolutely. And well, congrats on the contribution in the new book launch.
Thank you.
And I guess I'd say who would you say the book is for if like somebody wanted to buy it?
Yeah. I would say that the whole anthology is really for people who are developing training programs. So
Hmm.
instructional designers, learning and development professionals, professional facilitators, anyone who's really in that talent development space. And also might be interesting to people who are are curious about what drives people and their motivations in the workplace, because there's a lot of reference and understanding to kind of core human desires and how those desires influence the way we interact and behave at work. So, somebody who might be interested in some sort of like, what are the hacks to some behavioral change? Yeah. And how could we inject a little bit more fun in the workplace? So, I think those would be some markets that would, or people and their interests that would be interested in it.
Absolutely, yeah. It's good
Hmm.
to know even the average work person can take that and use that
Yeah.
knowledge. Mhm.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I guess if people want to work with you or like your company, or if they just want to connect with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm available on LinkedIn. It's always the best place to find me. I'm assuming that you'll put my information and bio in the links in your show notes here. But it's Ginine Capozzi with unique spelling, so I'm easy to find with KnowledgeForce Consulting, and that's really the best way. Drop me a note there. I am on LinkedIn regularly. They're always welcome as well to check out my website, which is knowledgeforceconsulting.com. And if they check it out regularly, I give some freebies away. So freebies get shown up on my website, social media channels. And I always am open to just conversation since I very much believe in the power of one. I never know what conversation is going to lead to something. So if you're just curious and getting to know me a little bit more and the services, or if something I said today sparks you when it comes to L&D, when it comes to scaling, or if it even comes to one-on-one coaching, yeah, I'd love to talk to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Janine. This has been great. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me on. I appreciate it.
Of course.